She was only 12 years old when they sent her away. A child wrapped in silks, her tiny hands trembling as she stepped aboard a ship that would carry her across a cold, grey sea, from the glittering halls of France to the stormy shores of England. Her name was Isabella of France, daughter of the mighty King Philip IV. History would one day call her the She-Wolf of France, a name whispered with fear, disgust, and fascination. But before the rebellion, before the betrayal, before the blood, there was a girl who became a queen against her will, a bride offered like a token of peace between two rival kings, and beside her stood a husband, King Edward II, who never wanted her, who reserved his love for another. In the silent corridors of a foreign palace, Isabella learned that crowns could be cages, and that a queen's tears were meant to be hidden behind jewels. But from that silence, something dangerous began to grow. Not love, not mercy, but vengeance. Because when a child is forced into a nightmare, even innocence can turn into fury. Yet Isabella's pain was not born from cruelty alone. It was born from politics. Long before she ever met her husband, her life had already been sold for peace. In royal courts, love was a luxury. Alliances were the currency of survival. And across the Channel, two kings, one of England, one of France, were about to trade a young girl's fate for a fragile promise of peace. England and France, two kingdoms bound by blood, yet divided by ambition, had spent generations locked in conflict. Castles burned, soldiers fell, and the people paid the price for their king's pride. King Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair, ruled with cold precision. His eyes were set not only on power, but on legacy. To him, alliances were not forged with trust, but with bloodlines. Across the Channel, King Edward I of England, the hammer of the Scots, was dead, leaving his son, Edward II, to inherit a throne he neither desired nor understood. The new king was young, emotional, and easily swayed, and that made him vulnerable. So when the French king offered his daughter Isabella as a bride, it was not a gift, it was a test. A fragile thread of peace was spun between two crowns soaked in centuries of war. Isabella was barely 12 when she was betrothed. Her beauty was praised, her grace admired, but beneath the flattery, her future was already sealed. She would never again belong to herself. The wedding took place in Boulogne-sur-Mer, a dazzling ceremony of gold and velvet, watched by nobles and priests, recorded by history as a moment of triumph. But for Isabella, it was the beginning of her captivity. Edward II. Her new husband was a man of contradictions, a king more comfortable among commoners than courtiers, more drawn to his favorite, Piers Gaveston, than to his own queen. Even on their wedding day, whispers spread through the crowd that the king's eyes followed another man more than his bride. To the world, this marriage promised unity. To Isabella, it delivered isolation. She had been traded for peace, but peace, like love, was something she would never know. And as the trumpets faded and the festivities ended, the child princess looked out across the dark waters of the Channel, toward the home she would never see again. She had crossed a sea for her father's ambition. She did not yet know that the same ambition would one day drown her husband's crown in blood. When the ships finally carried Isabella across the cold waters of the Channel, she looked back one last time at the coast of France, the home she would never truly see again. Ahead of her waited a kingdom she did not understand, and a husband she did not know. The winds of politics had delivered her to England's shores. But they could not promise her a welcome. The castles were grey, the skies heavy with rain, and the whispers even heavier. Isabella, the child queen of England, arrived in a kingdom that already had a queen of the king's heart. His name was Piers Gaveston. Handsome, charming, and dangerously arrogant, he had captured Edward's affection long before Isabella set foot on English soil. The two men were inseparable, riding together, dining together, laughing together, while the new queen sat alone in her chambers, surrounded by strangers who spoke a tongue that twisted harshly in her ears. At court, Isabella's presence was an inconvenience. Her jewels and dowry were flaunted as trophies of alliance, but her voice carried no weight. When she walked into the hall, the laughter dimmed, not out of respect, but from curiosity. The French princess was young, delicate, and foreign. To some, she was a symbol of peace. To others, a reminder of their king's shame. Even during state occasions, Edward's coldness was impossible to hide. He placed Gaveston above all, granting him titles, lands, and even the royal crown jewels for his personal use. And when Isabella tried to speak, she was ignored. The crown on her head, one chronicler wrote, was heavy with solitude. The nobles grew furious at Gaveston's influence. They despised the favoritism, the mockery, the way their king seemed blind to duty. And in the middle of their anger stood Isabella, the perfect image of a neglected queen. Behind closed doors, she played her part with quiet dignity. She smiled at ceremonies, offered toasts, and spoke softly when spoken to. But every night, as torches burned low in the corridors of Westminster, she wept in silence. When the nobles finally rose against Gaveston, capturing and executing him, Isabella might have felt a flicker of relief. But her husband's love died with his favorite. Edward II turned bitter, withdrawn, and suspicious. He looked upon his young wife not as a partner, but as a spy for her father, the King of France. And so the cold walls around Isabella grew higher. The laughter that once echoed through the palace was gone. In its place came tension, anger, and fear. She had entered England as a bride of peace. Now she was a prisoner of politics. And deep within her heart, something began to harden. A seed planted in loneliness that would one day bloom into rebellion. Isabella watched in silence. She was no longer a frightened child, but a young woman, a queen, and a mother. Her son, the future Edward III, became her only light in a kingdom drowning in darkness. But even motherhood could not shield her from humiliation. In Gaveston's place rose another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Cruel where Gaveston had been charming, ruthless where Gaveston had been bold. Despenser hungered for power, and Edward gave it to him without restraint. Together, they stripped the queen of her lands, her income, and her dignity. Her servants were dismissed, her possessions seized, her allies exiled. Despenser's greed stretched across the kingdom, seizing estates, imprisoning rivals, crushing any who opposed him. And once again, Isabella was forced into the shadows, yet behind her quiet composure, she was learning. She studied the court, the alliances, the ambitions of men who pretended to serve their king, and she began to understand a truth her father had always known, that power is never truly given. It is taken. When rebellion finally broke out against the Despensers in 1321, the country erupted into chaos.
Barons rose in arms, banners flew over burning towns, and England trembled beneath civil war. Edward's enemies were defeated, their lands forfeited, and the Despensers' tyranny grew stronger than ever.
But among the survivors of that rebellion, Isabella saw something new, an army of men who hated her husband more than they feared him. In their defeat, she saw opportunity. She had been patient for years, the obedient wife, the silent queen, the mother who endured in silence. But patience had reached its end. In the wreckage of a kingdom torn apart, Isabella began to plan her revenge. Not for love, not for pride, but for survival. Because a queen who is stripped of everything has nothing left to lose, except her fear. And as Isabella's silence hardened into resolve, the kingdom itself began to mirror her, silent, tense, and ready to break. England was rotting from within, the nobles restless, the commoners starving, and the king blind to the hatred festering beneath his crown. While Edward clung to his corrupt favorite, Isabella watched the realm unravel and saw in that chaos the perfect moment to strike. By 1325, England was broken, not by war but by fear. The Despensers ruled beside Edward II like wolves at a dying king's side, and even the queen was not safe. Her properties were gone, her household servants replaced by spies. Letters to her family in France were intercepted, her movements watched. When France demanded Edward pay homage for his lands across the Channel, he refused to go, afraid to leave his throne. Instead, he sent Isabella to the court of her brother, King Charles IV of France. The queen returned, not as a wife, but as an emissary, a prisoner disguised as a diplomat. She arrived in Paris dressed in mourning black, her face pale and expressionless. But behind that mask, her mind was sharper than ever. In France, she found safety and something more dangerous: freedom. For the first time in years, Isabella could speak without fear. She was celebrated as a victim of her husband's cruelty, pitied by nobles, admired by clergy. And it was there, in exile, that she met Roger Mortimer, an English nobleman who had fled Edward's wrath and escaped from the Tower of London. Their meeting was more than chance. It was fate. He was a man burned by vengeance, she a woman starved of power. Together they formed a bond, part love, part necessity, wholly dangerous. In secret they plotted. They raised money, forged alliances, and began to gather an army. The church turned against Edward. Nobles, once loyal to the king, now swore allegiance to Isabella and her cause. When she finally set sail from France in 1326, she was no longer the young queen who had crossed the sea in fear. She was a commander. With her banner bearing the image of St. George, Isabella landed in England beside Mortimer, her son, the heir to the throne, at her side. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers laid down their arms. Even the king's closest supporters deserted him. It was not an invasion. It was a reckoning. And as Isabella's army swept through the kingdom, the people whispered her new name: the she-wolf of France. The child who once wept in silence had returned, not as a victim, but as vengeance made flesh. The rebellion moved like a storm, swift, merciless, unstoppable. By the winter of 1326, Edward II was no longer a king. He was a fugitive, wandering through the countryside with the Despensers as his only allies, hiding from the very people who once bowed before him. When he was finally captured, drenched in mud and terror, his crown was already lost. Isabella had taken it, not by force of arms, but by the will of a nation that had turned against its ruler. The Despensers met their ends in ways that made even hardened soldiers avert their eyes. Hugh Despenser the Younger was dragged through the streets, mutilated and executed, his body torn apart as crowds cheered. And from her royal dais, Isabella watched, silent and expressionless. She had once been humiliated by that man. Now she saw him reduced to dust. Edward was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, a king without a throne, a husband without a wife, a man haunted by the echo of his own mistakes. Officially, Isabella ruled as regent for her son, the young Edward III. But behind her throne stood Roger Mortimer, her lover, her partner, her equal in ambition. For a time, they ruled together. England was calm again, its people grateful for the queen who had freed them from tyranny. Yet peace born of rebellion never lasts. In September 1327, word spread that Edward II was dead. The official report claimed illness, but the truth whispered through the corridors of history was far darker. Some said he was strangled in the night. Others claimed he was murdered with fire and iron, a punishment designed to leave no mark upon the body. No one knew for certain, and Isabella never spoke of it, but from that moment her crown gleamed brighter, and her conscience grew heavier. The she-wolf had devoured her prey. Yet in the silence that followed, she began to hear something she had long forgotten: the echo of guilt. Because when vengeance is complete, all that remains is the emptiness it leaves behind. For a time, Isabella ruled as though destiny itself had crowned her. England had a new order, a young king in name, and behind him, the queen and her lover pulling every string. The same men who once mocked her now bowed in fear. The same court that had pitied her now praised her power. But power once taken is never easily kept. Roger Mortimer grew bold, too bold. He filled the royal treasury with his spoils, placed his allies in every office, and treated the boy king Edward III as a puppet. The very sins that had doomed Edward II were now repeated by the man who claimed to have saved the realm. And Isabella, once the voice of restraint, began to change. She wore jewels taken from her enemies, held feasts that rivaled kings, and surrounded herself with whispers of decadence. The same people who had hailed her as England's savior began to see her as another tyrant. Her son watched in silence. He had grown into a young man, intelligent, proud, and tired of being ruled by the ghosts of his father's war. In 1330, when Edward III was just 18, he struck. One autumn night, his soldiers stormed Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella slept. The Queen's lover was dragged from his bed and condemned without trial. Before dawn, Roger Mortimer was hanged as a traitor. His body left to swing before the rising sun, the same fate he had once delivered to others. Isabella pleaded for his life, but no mercy came. Her reign was over. She was stripped of her power, her lands, her authority, but spared execution. Perhaps her son remembered the mother who once protected him, or perhaps he simply pitied her. The she-wolf was caged at last. In the years that followed, Isabella lived quietly in the countryside, surrounded by gardens, books, and memories that refused to fade. She wore black until her death, a widow twice over, once by betrayal and once by justice. The queen who had torn down a king now found herself haunted by the echo of the throne she had stolen. Years passed. The fire that once fueled her rebellion faded into quiet sorrow. The courts no longer feared her name, the chroniclers no longer sought her presence. Isabella of France became a ghost in her own lifetime, wandering gardens, whispering prayers, waiting for forgiveness that never came. But history does not grant peace easily. It remembers not the silence of age, but the roar of power. To some, Isabella of France was a monster, a queen who betrayed her husband, took a lover, and spilled royal blood to satisfy her ambition. To others, she was a survivor, a woman forced into a loveless marriage, stripped of power, and driven by the cruelty of those who mistook her silence for weakness. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the two. Isabella's story is not one of pure villainy or virtue. It is a story of what happens when innocence is bartered for politics, when a child is made into a queen before she learns what power truly costs. She died in 1358, far from the throne she had once seized, buried in quiet dignity. They say she was laid to rest wearing the habit of a nun, with the heart of her husband, Edward II, sealed inside a silver casket by her side. Was it remorse? Or a final reminder of the love she once sought and never found? No one can say for certain, but her legacy endures, not in the glory of her crown, but in the shadow she left behind. Because Isabella of France was never just a queen. She was proof that even in the gilded halls of royalty, the most dangerous battles are fought not with swords, but with silence, power, love, betrayal. In the end, these were the only truths that ever ruled kingdoms. Isabella of France's story is a reminder that beneath every crown lies a cage, and behind every royal vow, a sacrifice. She began as a daughter of peace and ended as a queen of vengeance, and though centuries have passed, her silence still echoes through history, warning us that the brightest crowns are often forged in the darkest shadows.